What's up? This is Mel's Prower. I'm back with another video, this time doing a follow-up to that mixing tutorial that I did not too long ago. A lot of people seem to really like it, and I cannot thank you guys enough for the support it got, so I figured I would do a part 2 that would answer some people's questions and just go a little more in-depth as to what I meant by my kind of workflow style. We're actually going to be using a different track this time though, this time a riddim thing that I did. It's not the most fleshed out or craziest idea ever, but I really like how the drums sound here, and the sub sounds really great too. So it just has a bit of everything of what I want to talk about today. So without further ado, this is what it sounds like. So it's not too crazy, but I really like how the drums sound here, and one of the main points that I want to make is actually about sound selection and just kind of modeling your drums. I've been making samples for quite a while now, and I recently released it. If anybody wants any of these kind of cool drum sounds, and there's also a rave stab one and basses, I'll put those in the description for anyone who's interested. But something I've learned by making those packs is that I've kind of grown an eye for these waveforms, especially with kicks. Like, I'll be able to describe what a kick sounds like, the main characteristic, just by kind of looking at it in depth by looking at the waveform. And something that you notice, especially if you're familiar with how kicks work, is that they're basically just sine waves that are being zapped. And because of that, they have a wide range of like tones that they can have. They can have like a very sharp and clicky one, or they can have a more thumpy one, just based on how fast that ramp is going. And with this case, a lot of riddim tracks, this kick was actually specifically kind of inspired by some Mad Dubs and Sizzy stuff, which have some more thumpy kicks that aren't so sharp and really in your face. The cool thing about this sample is that it's not too processed, which I like. It's normalized, like the volume isn't so weird and dipping like a lot of samples sometimes are, but it's easy enough for you to kind of work with. And that's what I like to do. I like to make some samples that I can get familiar with and I can constantly come back to. So often what I'll do is I'll just dip a bit at the mids, and this helps kind of get rid of some of that ugly mud from the mids. And then I'll just push it back up with a transient shaper, because this is going to get rid of some of that sweep. So just to kind of normalize it, I'm going to push it through the transient shaper, and also just so I can get that 0 dB clearance. It's not too different. That dip really does a lot to kind of help keep it clean. If I turn it off, it's just, yeah, it's thumpy and it's really harsh. But this helps keep it pretty clean. And once again, I want to mention that I'm not actually doing any bus clipping or anything like that. I heard some people mention that. They reference a lot of stuff like Ahi videos, and it hasn't worked for me. I just can't get that tone right. I prefer to send it all to one master, and it's kind of very destructive because of that, because then you don't really have a lot of headroom. But for me, I think, especially with bass music, it works really well to get a lot out of your sounds. That's how I'm pushing this stuff through. So the transient shaper can go pretty loud, but just enough to where it doesn't sound too distorted, but you get that nice 0 dB assurance. What else do we have here? We have claps, which are pretty harsh actually by themselves. This is also from my sample pack. I guess I mono it because I want to make sure that I'll have a nice mono center for when I add the reverb, which is kind of important. So the transient shaper here has a pretty interesting role actually. I'm turning up the attack, which is going to give us that nice transient hit. So the transient shaper here is actually doing a pretty interesting thing. I'm turning up the attack, which is going to give us that nice punch. But I'm also turning up the sustain, which is basically going to try to lift up as much of the tail as it can. And since we're fading this clap out, it's going to sound a little unnatural, but in a really nice way where it's almost full. And then we have an EQ to cut out any low stuff that the sustain is bringing up, and then reverb to make it fit the space and give it a nice wide caw sound. I would probably actually turn it down a little bit, but I kind of like that nice clipped sound with these claps because they keep it pretty consistent and it doesn't sound so like analog clappish. It sounds more like an actual whack. By just singling it out to one transient, you get a lot more punch out of it. So yeah, that's my clap rant. So again, drums aren't too crazy. They just have some nice character to them, some nice kind of rhythm, like metallic-ish things, and I think that's actually part of the fruited reverb impulse that I made. is an impulse I got from FL's Fruity Reverb plugin, which is normally a terrible reverb I've heard, but it has a nice metallic quality that I just kind of associate with riddim that's almost comb-like. The cymbals, nothing too crazy. I think it's just like some standard, yeah, I've also made these. Just a bit of reverb and then some nice kind of crash-ish effect going on here with the noisy hats. I think I would make this a little more dynamic by changing like the offbeat hat here, but just by having it some nice washy brightness color with this Mark sample, for example. It doesn't really have a tonal center, which allows it to kind of act as a very soft crash. That can really help to add some flow and also give your kicks and stuff a lot more masking to work with when you're distorting it. So I guess we can go into effects now, in which I want to talk about mids and sides. So some people were asking about mids and sides and how that plays into the mix. And it's kind of interesting. Some newcomers might be a little confused, but basically the idea is that in stereo, we have left and right channels, but there's also a pseudo kind of channel that you can kind of consider as the middle. Basically, this means this is anything that the left and right share in common, in this case, the mono tracks. So that will be the mids, and sides is basically anything that exclusively exists in the left or the right channel. That makes up the stereo information of the track. And because of that, we can actually process these separately, or at least kind of adhere to one of them. And that's what I'm doing here. In utility, you can actually change this width knob into a mid-sides kind of crossfade thing, which can be useful because you can actually almost extract different aspects of a track that might exist exclusively on the sides and mids. If I were to put this on the master, for example, you can kind of hear these elements individually without any kind of clashing happening. So that's the mids. This is the stereo. And you can easily tell that compared to the mids, there's not a lot being taken up. And because of that, that means we have a lot more room to work with if you want to like move stuff to the stereo. Of course, that means then it's going to be prone to phase, which you do want to be careful about. But thankfully, when it comes to stuff like effects, there's a lot more leeway because they're higher frequencies. They don't have much of a chance to clash because the waveforms are a lot more complex. So by using that, we can fill up any space by actually utilizing the stereo. So what I do is that I put an ozone imager on a lot of these effects loops, which I've made. And they're basically just like lasers, sweeps, and chants. And by having it stay in the stereo sides or be a lot more stereo heavy, they can kind of get out of the way of the basses, but still sound very present in the mix. There's something about a stereo signal that actually makes it a bit louder to us than if it were in mono, for example. I think it has to do with like the Haas effect, where like you're basically hearing a double and therefore your brain hears it as twice the volume or something like that. I'm no expert on that, but I feel like that might be the idea as to why. So the main idea here is that we're going to try to fill up that sides element of the track with effects, so that way they can get out of the way of the basses, but still sound present in the mix. You can use stuff like Ozone Imager, which I think is the best because it actually tries its best to keep stuff within phase, but still stereo. And yeah, it's a really good tool. Sub, pretty simple. It's just a sine wave and then some stereo pink noise. The benefits of having pink noise and having it stereo is just that it sounds a little softer to the ear and it's not so like annoying to work with. And I'm just distorting it with some kilohertz distortion, which is really great. I'm just normal drive, nothing too crazy. And then I'm dipping the upper mids, which will get rid of some of those harmonics that might be a little annoying and give it a nice rumble that is deep. And I usually kind of monitor the sub by looking at it on the spectrum. In Ableton, there's this Spectrum plugin that basically just gives you a real-time frequency curve. And if you set this range from auto to this range mode, you can actually set it from 0 to -10. And I'm not sure what graph or scale it's using. This mentions log, so it could be that. Basically, it allows you to meter the sub because you're cutting out all of that higher frequency information. It gives you a good focus. So I'll usually analyze tracks with this on, and usually they hit around like -2, -3. The ones that I really like sound good, like Sissy, Skrillex, that kind of stuff. So that's when I know like how loud my sub should be. That's usually what I try to shoot for. And then I'll just like try to make it fit. And usually that just goes down to dipping some of the mids and stuff, and then making room for the bass. So I guess now we can actually break down the bass element, which the last track didn't really seem to have one, so that's why I wanted to do this one. If I play it by itself, it's nothing too crazy. They're basically just like basses without any sub on it. And that's important because obviously you want to make a room with the sub. So what I'm doing here on the main one is that I'm basically just low cutting and then doing some shelf boosting into a saturator. I learned this thing from NASCO. I think it's meant for like bass samples that already have sub in it. A really good way to kind of get more out of it is to actually do a high shelf into a saturator, or in this case like the Ableton saturator with like a clip on. I don't know why, but for me it just sounds a lot cleaner than if you were to push it through saturator, and I think that's because you're basically dynamically pushing it through a saturator instead of like the whole drive collectively. That can really help to get a lot of mileage out of your sounds, and doing a lot of low mid stepping too helps, so that way it doesn't sound so ugly. Especially if you have some stereo elements, it can get kind of annoying in my opinion. You know, I'll just cut all of that and then put a reverb, and then I have a soothe just to kind of take out any harsh artifacts from the spectral processing. And then a delay is really great to get some slapback delay sort of happening, which will give your track some space if you're using any rhythmic stuff that is very kind of space heavy. And I think that's pretty much it. If you want to look at the lofts I'm hitting here, looks like it's averaging around -12. It's just something you kind of gotta get an ear for. I recommend just listening to tracks and comparing it to yours and seeing how you can get it close enough. Yeah, that's pretty much for the bass. Lastly, I just want to talk about some quick mastering stuff. OTT on the master, it sometimes works. I sometimes really like that sound actually, but obviously it's going to create some phase issues. If we were to compare the waveforms, especially with the kick, there's a lot more interesting things happening. You have like a disperser effect, which is basically from the bands being split like that. And like even the phase rotation is off compared to this, and you want to be very careful with OTT on the master. Sometimes I like to do it because it gives it some nice juice, almost like a disperser effect, and it can be a great creative mixing tool, but you want to be very careful if you care a lot about your phase being proper. Next up, people were talking about some clipping options. In Ableton, there is the glue compressor, which is not too bad, but I feel like it just sounds really kind of too soft for me. I feel like you can get a lot more mileage out of the G clip, and that's actually thanks to this softness knob, which I think is the best because it allows you to get a median of that wave shaping. This is just very simple, it's very straightforward, it even has oversampling, but if you have Ableton, you can use the glue compressor with no problem, or the Ableton saturator. Just make sure that you have soft clip on, and with the glue compressor, make sure you have the range at 0, which is basically going to avoid any clipping that's happening. So by turning it down, it turns off that compressor mode and basically acts like a normal clipper. But if you notice, it has a more dirty sound. It's almost kind of guttery, which I don't really like. I think the clip just sounds a lot cleaner with that. But yeah, I mean, hopefully that helped. I'm not sure. I feel like this one is even more rambly than the last one, but if you guys have any more questions, please tell me in the comments. Please go make sure to check out my sample pack. I know it's kind of weird to drop that trailer. I've been working on this for much further than I started this channel. But I think it has some really great sounds that a lot of people might like. I try to make sure that they're normalized and they're high quality and not so like kind of cheaply tossed in. These are samples that I really cared about. So if anyone is really interested in checking those out, I'll put those in the description. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.